Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever Story Valley Convention. My name is Jesse Pullman. I'm a science fiction and fantasy author and recovering teacher from Long Island, New York, and I have the distinct pleasure of moderating our panel on science in science fiction. This panel features real scientists who bring science fiction to life. Discover how these professionals collaborate with storytellers to weave plausible and compelling scientific concepts into narratives. Avid fans of the genre, aspiring writers, and curious scientists will enjoy this discussion all about science. Bring all those questions you've been itching to ask a scientist. Ask them in Discord chat and they'll do their best to answer while the video plays. If you see me looking down and away from the camera, it's probably me scribbling down notes to possibly tie back in later. You may also see my cat hop up on my desk and possibly need to be located if she gets, well, catty with me. Without further ado, let me turn this panel over to its collaborators with our first question, and it starts off with AG. First, let's go around, introduce ourselves, and give our backgrounds. What areas of science do each of you operate in, and how would you tie that to sci-fi, and what prior works have you created?
Hey there, my name's AG. I'm a writer, voiceover artist that has dabbled in writing since the early 2010s. I'm also a U.S. military veteran where I specialized in land navigation and radar, and I'm also a commercial pilot. My writing expertise is largely based around horror and sci-fi, with the bulk of my material centered around soft sci-fi or science fiction, let's say, that takes certain creative liberties with the current framework of science. However, that doesn't mean that I don't enjoy a good hard sci-fi novel. In my mind, there is no greater achievement in literature than to craft a great sci-fi story while following the most up-to-date science. That is because, in my humble opinion, there's just simply no greater mechanism to inspire wonder in us than science. And even in the most mundane disciplines, there exists an element of magic to uncover. One of my sci-fi works is a book called Eden's Chroma, and it's a dystopian epic that blends religious symbology with futuristic technology that is repurposed for wasteland survival.
All right, Max, you're up.
Hi, I'm Max, known professionally as MC Siegel. I'm a writer of both a fiction and a research mathematician, having graduated in 2022 with a PhD in mathematics from the University of Southern California with a specialization in analysis and number theory. When I'm not writing, I'm usually doing work researching the infamous Collatz conjecture. When it comes to writing, I'm something of a maverick. I guess you could say I write science fantasy, but that hardly does it justice. One of the classic divides in genre fiction is the perceived incompatibility between high fantasy and science fiction. My writing tears down this wall like it's Berlin in November 1989. To give you an example, I spent last month finishing up the first draft of a high fantasy set on a hard sci-fi world of ammonia methane-based life forms that utilize electricity as their cellular energy currency instead of chemical energy, like our ATP-using life forms here on Earth. But they also have a song-based magic system, because why not? I've used the advanced mathematics I've learned in graduate school to inspire my world building, from minor or major plot details all the way to going so far as to construct a grand, unified theory of magic using functional and harmonic analysis. As it turns out, magic is just a continuous linear functional induced by the duality pairings of Banach spaces. Who knew? The Rees-Markov-Kakutani representation theorem can be used to make portals to other universes, and the Fourier transform, the Planck length, and panpsychism all have very interesting things to say to one another. I've been writing seriously for over a decade, though it was only in spring of 2023 that I finally began sharing my works with the public. I've got 2.75 trunk novels under my belt, but since 2018, I've been working on my biggest project to date, The Worms of Andalon. That's ampersand ALON. The spelling is the way it is for certain legal reasons. Worms is an apocalyptic hospital medical science fantasy horror drama of cosmic proportions. Basically, it's about a plague that ends the world, but also turns many people, including the main character, a hospital neuropsychiatrist, into magical fungal lindworms. And it's currently being serialized online on Royal Road. I'm about halfway through the first draft of the fourth and final volume of the story, which should be finished before the end of the year and be second drafted come spring 2025. Given that each of the 4 volumes is over 250,000 words long, I'll be releasing it as a self-published work on Amazon once I finish the third draft. After that, I'll try and write something shorter in the hopes that a traditional publisher might be willing to bite. You can find me on Discord, Reddit, YouTube, and my personal website. I'll probably make a Facebook page sometime in the near future.
All right, and that leaves us with Solar.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Jacek, but I go by Solar since that's easier to pronounce. I'm Polish and I study mechatronics engineering. This is basically a study that encompasses the entire manufacturing and design process for all kinds of electromechanical things, from material science through electrical engineering to database management, things like that. I also personally take some interest in civil engineering, in military engineering, quantum mechanics, basically anything that piques my interest. And yeah, I write hard science fiction. I haven't published anything yet, since I'm also a master of procrastination. But yeah, I put a very big emphasis on making sure that everything is in my works is as hard and as realistic as it can possibly be.
All right. So that brings us to our first full-on question. Everyone go around and tell us what your take on the many elements that go into the sci-fi genre, such as aesthetics and believability, are. For example, we've already mentioned the parallels of hard sci-fi versus soft sci-fi to consider. But how do you reconcile those and go about deciding the best circumstances under which to insert science into a narrative? So taking the idea of like, hey, you've got this story you want to tell and applying that to science and coming up with something to work with. AG, you're first.
All right, thank you. So yes, science fiction is most often split between the hard science and or soft science, or as I like to call it, fantasy science. This delicate balance shapes the narrative, influences the reader's suspension of disbelief, and ultimately defines the genre's impact. Legitimate by-the-book science is grounded in current scientific understanding and principles, and lends credibility and plausibility. And for the especially nerdy among us, it offers a bridge between what is applicable and what is wondrous. It allows the reader to envision a future that could potentially unfold, fostering a sense of awe and curiosity about the possibilities of scientific advancement. However, on the flip side, it can also be limiting, as it requires the writer to adhere to the constraints of known science, potentially stifling creativity, and I guess in a sense, boxing in the story. On the other hand, fantasy science or soft science is typically unbound by the laws of physics and reality. But I think it offers the benefit of that is it offers more creative freedom. It enables the writer to explore imaginative worlds and concepts that defy conventional understanding. This can lead to innovative and thought-provoking narratives, but it also risks alienating readers who prefer a more grounded approach. For an aspiring writer, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches is definitely crucial. Striking the right balance between legitimate and fantasy science can enhance the story's appeal, making it both intellectually stimulating and wildly imaginative. This balance, I think, not only enriches the narrative, but also broadens the writer's creative horizons, allowing them to craft stories that resonate with a diverse audience. For my segment, I like to particularly zero in on a particular subgenre of science fiction, which is military sci-fi. Military science fiction is a subgenre that often explores the intricacies of warfare, strategy, and the impact of advanced technology on combat. It can range from meticulously researched depictions of future military hardware to imaginative portrayals of fantastical weaponry and tactics. As a Navy veteran myself, I've often envisioned some of the advantages that futuristic technology can bring an enlightened civilization. But if you happen to spot an enlightened civilization anytime soon, be sure to point them out. I'd like to ask them some questions.
All right, Max, you're up.
That was really well said, AG. Very elegant. So I'm going to be frank with you, Jesse. As much as I love science fiction as a name for its genre, I think it leaves a lot to be desired. So if you don't mind, I'm going to answer this question by stating my own classifications. We'll start with speculative fiction. This is anything that steps away from realism, both past and present. Fantasy and sci-fi are two speculative fiction's biggest umbrellas. Next, there's what I like to call scientific fiction. Most, but not all, hard sci-fi will fall under this category. Greg Egan's orthogonal trilogy is the poster child of scientific fiction, as are the works of Jules Verne, Robert Forward, or Olaf Stapledon. Scientific fiction is what you might call the if-theoretic side of sci-fi. This is science fiction in its most literal, elemental sense. Fiction is a vehicle for the exploration of a speculative scientific concept. In this style of storytelling, the story serves science first and foremost. The fiction doesn't need to be scientifically hard, it just needs to go about things in a scientific way. Indeed, the Sherlock Holmes books would be a great example of non-speculative scientific fiction for that very reason. Works of scientific fiction and fantasy, such as the novels of Ursula K. Le Guin's Hamish cycle, could also fall under this category because of their dedicated exploration of the thought experiments that spawned them. Whether the speculation is in physics, chemistry, or human sociology, science fiction is one where science is treated as a topic. The ideas are in the driver's seat. And when science is your topic, I think it behooves you to go out and learn as much as you reasonably can about the ideas you're tinkering with so that you can arm yourself with the subtleties and implications that give them a vivid, full-bodied presentation. In this style of science fiction, world building and storytelling become fused. By fleshing out the details of your scientific speculations, you learn about scenarios and possibilities that you can bring to bear in your story. Next, we have hard science fiction. This is any story of speculative fiction that takes pains to make sure its speculation is scientifically plausible. Most of the time, this will also be scientific fiction, because who wants to build a scientifically hard setting only to use it as a mere backdrop? A soap opera that just so happens to be hard science fiction would be an example of a hard science fiction that isn't also scientific fiction. Across from this, there's what you might call sci-fi, whereas science fiction and scientific fiction are about real science and the applications of scientific attitudes to fiction writing. Sci-fi uses the trappings of science for reasons of aesthetics and plot. I'm putting Dune in this category, along with the likes of the Halo games and Babylon 5. Most space operas go here, such as The Expanse, both the novels and the TV adaptation. Now to my big point. The difference between, say, a hard sci-fi story like Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama, and a softer one like Dune or The Expanse, is that rather than being an integral part of their storytelling, the softer sci-fi science arises in the form of plot devices and aesthetic decor. A good way to tell how important the story science is to see how much of the story you can preserve by changing it from sci-fi to, say, high fantasy. You can make The Expanse into high fantasy, for example, by replacing the proto-molecule with some ancient, lost magical artifact left behind by a race of beings from a different plane of existence, which ends up opening a portal to another world, which people then explore and fight over. This would preserve the story's plot beats, but use a completely different set of aesthetics. On the other hand, for The Left Hand of Darkness, you could easily write that story in a high fantasy setting without altering a single dot of Le Guin's world building about sex and gender, because of how wonderfully thorough she was in constructing their androgynous culture. In my opinion, in order to understand where and how science is needed in your story, it's helpful to take a look at both your story's conflicts and the resolutions, or lack thereof, that you provide them. Whether it's a large-scale environmental conflict, such as the scarcity of water on Arrakis, or a much more minute detail, such as how an alien race's biology affects their psychology, the driving forces behind your story's conflicts and assumptions are going to be the keystone for most of your readers. As long as you can make your readers suspend their disbelief at those important points, you've successfully scienced your science fiction. And just one last thing, aside from these plot-centric feats of science, there's also the matter of science's minor details. These are the parts of world building that, while not strictly necessary for the plot's equation to make sense, nevertheless enrich the reader's experience into something much more vivid and real. And oftentimes that can be all that separates a memorable piece of science fiction from an unforgettable one.
Awesome. Solar.
So I agree in that believability and realism don't necessarily coincide with hard sci-fi. You can have a very realistic story without any hard science fiction elements, or in fact set in a fantasy setting. For example, Discworld by Terry Pratchett is, for me, one of the most realistic book series ever written. And it's about as far from science fiction as you can possibly get. And Pratchett achieves that by writing extremely realistic characters, which in many ways is more important than the technology of your setting. But yeah, when it comes to sci-fi specifically, I think it's best to do it at the stage of world building in order to give yourself ideas. Because physics, real physics, always inherently restricts your ability to write yourself out of corners as a writer. And that means that the characters have to get creative and you have to get creative. And many times this leads to a greater story overall. For example, in my book, Dusk of Empires, the FTL drive, which is called the decoherence drive, and it functions by basically distributing the ship that you're trying to move, distributing its quantum wave function over a very wide area, and then manipulating probability to make it appear somewhere else, which isn't really important to what it does. It's effectively a teleport. However, I made it so it abides by the conservation of energy. And when you're jumping between 2 points of different gravitational potential, you're changing your, gravitational potential energy. And the difference in that energy gets dumped into the craft as heat. So you can't jump too close to a planet or you're going to boil your crew. And this introduces a lot of constrictions on where the ship can jump and how far, how long travel takes. But it also gives me as a writer some ideas on how to work around that. So, for example, you can cool a ship down by, for example, 10 degrees or something like that, right before jumping, which allows you to get closer to a planet. And this gives me an opportunity to write an interesting scene where entire crew prepares, gets in hibernation seats, and cools their organisms down to temperatures that normally they wouldn't be able to reach. And then everything fills with liquid nitrogen, things like that. And then you have a jump, and everything suddenly heats up. That's an interesting scene that might interest people in how exactly the drive works and research potential energy.
Okay, so moving on. Speaking as someone with a history background, I'm always interested in the way that we got to where we are. Our grandparents, or our parents, depending on how old we were, watched as sci-fi concepts like Star Trek's tricorder got brought into some form of reality, like a smartphone, which I'm sure you've all seen, one of these little guys, and they do all these cool things. In what ways can we expect sci-fi to be believable versus how much of it might remain a fantasy, and how have you seen this sort of idea evolve in your area of expertise? In other words, how has the fantasy and the fiction become real? How do you expect it to?
Yeah, so mention of tricorders is interesting, not only because Star Trek is one of my favorite sci-fi series, but because it's only one example of literally countless where sci-fi has essentially predicted much of the groundbreaking technology that we see today. Artificial intelligence immediately springs to mind, not only in civilian applications, but in the military as well. And while believability is a somewhat transient word that shifts from generation to generation, I mean, our great-grandparents likely would have found AI chatbots to be unbelievable, but here we are. I think there are certain elements that will remain both beyond logistical and imaginative limits, at least for now. As we've touched on earlier, FTL, teleportation, matter generation. I mean, these are a few examples that push the limits of hard sci-fi. But who can say how much of this will hold true in the next few decades? Humanity has accomplished more technological feats in the past 100 years than ever in our species' history, just due to technological acceleration. And there's really just no limit to what we can accomplish, in my humble opinion. In my experience, the use of AI and machine learning in predictive analytics enhances threat assessment and decision-making. Autonomous systems reduce risk to personnel and increase operational efficiency. And additionally, systems like VR and AR provide realistic training scenarios, which improves readiness and adaptability for our soldiers and military weapons.
Awesome. Max.
So one thing just on the classic tricorder is what I love about that is the tricorder becoming the smartphone is a self-fulfilling prophecy. One of the greatest powers of science fiction, especially when done well, is to inspire. And generations that grew up watching Star Trek and being amazed by the technology displayed there, that inspired them to try and make something in real life. And this is one way in which we can expect to see science fiction and technology evolve, is that sci-fi and just fiction in general, it can show us the light of a better world and give us something to strive toward. As for the rest of the question, I think I covered most of it in my previous response. So since I don't want to monopolize the panel, let me just add that at the end of the day, I feel it is the story the writer wants to tell that determines where and how much of a story's science needs to be believable. Just do enough self-reflection to know how you like your science in your stories and be consistent about it in your writing. I personally like sharing a lot of scientific details in my stories, even ones that aren't strictly relevant to the plot. Consequently, my readers rightly come to expect that I'm going to take scientific details into account in my writing. As for my area of scientific expertise, math is probably one of the only really magical things we have left in this day and age. I wouldn't be surprised if there were more stories involving mathematicians, fictional or otherwise, than stories that involve math in the same way that Robert Forward's Dragon's Egg involves the physics of a neutron star. And if you do happen to find such a story, Greg Egan probably wrote it.
Awesome. So,
Writers as far as the 1800s were predicting all kinds of different technologies, from radio to radars to airships and airplanes, eventually even space stations, which were predicted as far as 1869 in the novel The Brick Moon. So yeah, science fiction can definitely be way ahead of its time in many aspects, and I think that it's important to keep predicting things, even if they aren't, even if most of our predictions don't end up being correct. It will be interesting for later generations to look back on what we were thinking the future would look like. It also speaks about the zeitgeist of the current era, the way people look at the future. For example, way back in the 1500s, 1600s, I believe, maybe a little later, people were predicting that you would be able to fly on personal flying vehicles that looked more like bicycles with wings than anything. But in general, they didn't predict much of a shift in living conditions. And that perhaps speaks about how they weren't really thinking about the social impact of technology. Meanwhile, in the current day, we think about the impact of the social impact of technology a lot. Everything from the Terminator to, with AI destroying the world, to The Expanse, changing geopolitics with the colonization of space. We put a lot of mental effort into predicting how society might change. And yeah, it's more interesting, I think, for the future generations to get a better look at how we were thinking, just like we can look back right now and see how our ancestors were thinking.
well said. Next question. We've already touched on this a little bit, but we're going to go a little deeper now. One area of recent emergent concern, especially for us creatives, has been artificial intelligence or AI. Dating as far back as the metal automatons of Greek myth or the mythological golems, the idea that humanity might create some kind of independent, non-human intelligence is nothing new, but science fiction takes AI to the next level. Especially with regards to your field, what are some ways that AI might shape the future, including, but not limited to, its militarization?
So I think one of the most significant contributions of AI to the military is its ability to process vast amounts of data at unprecedented speeds. This capability provides military commanders with real-time insights and predictive analytics, enhancing situational awareness and enabling faster, more informed decision-making. By analyzing patterns and trends, AI can predict potential threats and suggest optimal courses of action, thereby improving strategic planning and operational efficiency. There are other significant areas where AI promises sweeping enhancements, such as cybersecurity and logistics. But areas that relate particularly to the human element are what I find fascinating, or the areas that I find fascinating is training and simulation. AI-driven virtual and augmented reality systems provide realistic training environments for soldiers. And these simulations could replicate complex combat scenarios, allowing for safe, repeatable training exercises. Essentially, soldiers are perfected through video game-like repetition, which is a sobering thought. When I think of all the hours I spent memorizing maps in GoldenEye or Perfect Dark on the N64, imagine soldiers performing the same repetition through simulated blueprints of a compound they've been tasked to clear. And this could segue into ethical considerations as well for the aspiring sci-fi writer. How do you ensure your soldiers understand the distinction between real combat and virtual training when the two become indistinguishable? How do you keep them from killing actual people with the same detachment as the computer opponents that they've killed countless times? So those are my thoughts on it.
Cool. Max?
Well, it's obviously important to deal with the problems that arise. I can't help but see our current issue with AI as just one facet of the larger socio-political dilemma facing modern civilization, which is the ever-increasing rapidity of our way of life. Has human society reached the point where it is developing too quickly to be able to meaningfully regulate itself and change course, if necessary? I honestly don't know, though I want to hope that we still have time. Sci-fi wise, there's also the issue of the technological singularity. Is it even possible, or will we eventually hit some kind of reality block? I genuinely don't know. At the risk of being optimistic, I'd like to think that if things go well, AI could be used to enhance and complement human judgment, much as AG was suggesting. And in fact, here I can actually talk about some math stuff. So in math, algebraic geometry and its number-theoretic relatives are infamous for being complicated, scary, and very difficult to get into, certainly too difficult for me. When it comes to mathematical achievements like Andrew Wiles' famous proof of Fermat's last theorem, a 300-year-old problem in the 1990s, it's not an overstatement to say that there are only a handful of people on Earth right now who understand all of the necessary information for every part of the proof. In these areas of mathematics, scholars often have to black box a result or area of expertise, which means that we treat certain big results without knowing using them without knowing any of the intricate details associated to them, just because it would take too much time to learn all of it. As Kevin Buzzard has pointed out, there's some really concerning things beginning to happen, and we seem to be facing a crisis of reproducibility, where so much material ends up getting black boxed that mistakes are being made. The famous example Buzzard pointed out was of a journal accepting a certain paper and then later accepting a paper which claimed to prove the exact opposite of what the first paper proved, which is impossible. They can't both be right. Because of this, there's arisen a movement to embrace computer-assisted proofs. Just like in the military, there's too much information for mathematicians to handle, and so what we've done is developed software programs that let us churn through the logical details of a mathematical argument to check for any errors. Lean, L-E-A-N, is one of the biggest proof check assistants out there right now, and Peter Schulze, one of our blazing quasars of algebra geometric brilliance, was actually so concerned that his theory of condensed mathematics might have a hole in it that he challenged the mathematical community with his liquid tensor project to write up his proof in Lean and have it formally verified, which was eventually done. Just a few months ago, Alex Kantorovich, who I personally know, worked with Terence Tao to produce a fully Leanified proof of the prime number theorem, a result which says that the number of prime numbers less than or equal to x is approximately x divided by the natural logarithm of x, with the approximation getting more accurate as x gets larger and larger. In the near future, research mathematicians might have to use Lean and other AI helpers simply because the amount of information they'll be working with is more than what any individual human being can grasp. Maybe overcoming this will require turning human beings into biological computers like the Mentacs of Dune, or maybe we'll need to blend man and machine at the physiological level. Only time will tell.
Solar.
Okay, so the other panelists talked a lot about what the AI can do. And I would like to talk about what the AI can't do or how people tend to overestimate it.
Ooh.
Especially in the context of military applications. So military AI is most associated with autonomous weapon systems. And people talk a lot about how autonomous weapon systems are ethically problematic, how they might lead to much more devastation than otherwise than human like operated systems would. But here is the thing. So autonomous weapon systems are weapons that, once set up, will attack targets within a designated area without further human input. I think that's a fair definition to go by. And the problem is that minefields fit this definition, since they are set up by humans, and the designated area is right above the mine, and the condition for attack is somebody stepping on the mine. And that is quite a broad spectrum of targets, let's say, with a small area of attack. I think AG will agree with it. And what AI does is it constrains the target set and broadens the area. So an AI-controlled or machine learning-controlled missile, let's say, will target, let's say, an entire battlefield-like zone. So let's say a 10 by 10 kilometer square area. And it will attack point targets within that area. The same thing with drone swarms and things like that. And so it attacks a larger area than mines, but it's more like selective. So in some ways, we already have autonomous weapon systems that are much more destructive and much more dangerous to civilians and prone to collateral damage than AI ever could be. And the only threat is trusting too much in the AI. So this is something to consider when you're thinking about what autonomous weapon systems can do. Because what you can do with an AI controlled missile, you can most likely do with a normal missile already. And the destructive power is not dependent on the AI, it's dependent on the warhead.
I was thinking of Skynet, not landmines, but sure. Brings us to question number 5. Let's think of the classic space opera setting for a minute, which often has AI in it. A setting where we're looking at interstellar spans of distance. What are some of the scientific principles behind interstellar travel, both in terms of soft sci-fi and hard sci-fi? Is faster than light, aka FTL, travel in the cards? Or are we likely to be restrained to sublight transportation? How can an author integrate these ideas into their stories? I know it's a broad question. Take it, do with you what you will with it.
All right. So as soft sci-fi allows for creative liberties, the writer is less concerned with the rigid principles of established science. FTL travel is often explained away with the warping of space-time, a kind of bubble that compresses space in front of the ship and expands it behind it. Wormholes are another concept that allow users to cross vast distances in a short amount of time. They're sometimes called Einstein-Rosen bridges, doorways that allow vessels to cross universe in a matter of moments. I'll let the mathematicians discuss their plausibility, which fortunately we have one in the room with us. But as of right now, these are what I would consider soft sci-fi staples due to their theoretical nature. Another method seen in space operas and other soft sci-fi stories is hyperspace, parallel dimensions where the laws of physics simply don't match our existing understanding. Kind of a sciencey way of saying it's magic. But on the hard sci-fi stage, I would argue that sublight travel is the dominant method, which may be a contentious opinion, simply because I think it more closely aligns with our current understanding of physics, how light travels, the effects of time dilation, etc. One such example is relativistic speed, where the faster a ship goes, the more time dilates. Other fascinating examples are ships where generations of human beings live and die on a lengthy voyage, which more plausibly explains how a civilization might travel across the stars. Just people spending their entire lives on a claustrophobic ship. Whatever your flavor is, there are a few things I would recommend to an author. Just establish clear rules for how interstellar travel works in your universe. Whether you're using FTL drives or sublight travel, consistency is the key to maintaining the suspension of disbelief. Consider how your chosen method of travel affects your characters. Time dilation, for example, that can create emotional or psychological challenges for characters as they deal with the passage of time, how it affects the loss of loved ones that, they may age and die in the blink of an eye. Use the limitations and possibilities of your travel technology to drive the plot. For instance, a malfunctioning warp drive could strand characters in uncharted space. Generation ship could face internal conflicts over resources and leadership as new citizens grow and take over. That can create schisms. And then lastly, even in soft sci-fi, grounding some aspects of your technology in real science, that can add some depth and credibility to your story. Research current scientific theories and try to incorporate them into your narrative wherever possible.
Max?
Yeah, I definitely say, AG, you're definitely on the same wavelength here. So I would be the happiest person in the world if FTL could be made real, but personally, I doubt it will happen unless there's a major, earth-shattering reevaluation of our basic understanding of the laws of physics. Frankly, I think it's more feasible in the sense that it's less theoretically impossible that we will have some kind of warp drive or wormhole tech. While traveling faster than light appears to be impossible, according to our current understanding of physics, we know that it is very much possible to stretch or shrink the fabric of space-time. In that regard, I think the most realistic FTL travel is the often used wormhole gate network, where a civilization spends hundreds of thousands to millions of years traveling across space at sublight speeds and building a wormhole gates as they go to enable those who came after to travel through the wormholes at an instant. Story-wise, both FTL possible and FTL impossible settings have their potential uses. FTL possible is obviously the gold standard of space opera, and sometimes this is just treated as basic hand-wavium, but some authors can turn soft sci-fi FTL travel into plot points of their own with sufficiently creative world building. For example, in Apple Plus's excellent adaptation of Asimov's Foundation series, though FTL is possible, it's only used by the rich and powerful, such as the Empire of Trantor and its well-ranking citizens. Even then, ordinary human beings have to be put into suspended animation during FTL because the experience of being in hyperspace causes people psychological problems. Because of this, a race of FTL-resistant humans were genetically engineered by the Empire to operate their warp travel, which becomes a significant plot point later in the show. At the same time, for poorer folks, sleeper ships exist where passengers get preserved in suspended animation as they travel the universe the long way, often for centuries at a time. What's great is that all of these ideas aren't merely set dressing. The show's writers use them in meaningful ways, and it lends them an air of believability and verisimilitude. A character returns to her home planet after a centuries-long sleeper ship voyage, only to find that it is completely devoid of human inhabitants due to the effects of a long-term environmental crisis having played out. Similarly, when an interstellar trader leaves a planet that has his possible girlfriend on it, it means saying goodbye to her forever, because by the time he comes out of stasis for his sleeper ship's journey, she and everyone else he knows will be dead. Meanwhile, if he just had a little bit more money or influence, he could get to his destination in the blink of an eye using the Trantor's luxury spaceships. Now that's sci-fi world building.
Very well said. Solar.
Yes, so I agree with what AG said. So can FTL be hard sci-fi? That's a resounding no, but we can make it feel hard by applying hard sci-fi principles. So making it make sense within the universe, that's the most important thing, and then applying its rules consistently. So this is basically just making up new science to use in your science fiction. You can do it with magic systems as well. A hard magic system is no different to a system of new physics that you're using in a speculative sci-fi book. You're just exchanging, lab coats for robes. And yeah, so some examples of sci-fi that makes FTL feel hard is the Long Earth series, which it's not exactly FTL, at least not at first, but it basically it has a mode of travel between alternative universes, where when a conscious being flips a switch on a special device, that conscious being and anything it holds teleports either in one or the other direction on like a big line of parallel universes, which then is expanded upon with large ships which have AI built into them, which technically makes the entire ship the AI's body, which allows it to take passengers with it across the multiverse, which is quite interesting. And the most important thing is that the author or authors, as it was written by Pratchett and one other author, I forget the name right now. It was the rules of the FTL travel were applied creatively, and the characters within the story thought about how they can exploit them to make travel more convenient. Yeah, another example is the Stargate universe, which of course has Stargates, which are also very hard in how they are presented. While the science might be a bit iffy, they work very consistently within the universe, and everybody understands exactly how they work, why they work, and how to utilize them creatively, which again is quite important. So when somebody does something with a Stargate, the readers or the viewers understand exactly why that is happening and what it's going to achieve. And with a bit of creativity, they could have came up with that themselves. Meanwhile, for a counterexample of an FTL drive that isn't hard at all, that would be Star Wars Hyperspace, especially in the new trilogy. So yeah, there is no rules whatsoever, and it serves only as a plot device. So you cannot, as a reader, predict anything, and any solutions that the characters come up with don't feel satisfying because of that. It's essentially just aspulse after aspulse. Excuse my French. And some more examples of that would be Star Trek, Warp Speed, and Marvel FTL, which is not even considered within the story.
Alrighty. So now for our final formal question, and we're going to try to make this one a little quick just because we're a little short on time. Based on your experience, what are the one or maybe two big final takeaways that you want guests here to leave with? In other words, what's like this one key piece of advice that you can use to sum up all that we've talked about, give to the viewer, and the viewer will take it and go, this is going to help me write a better book. It could be something for new people. It could be something for people that are mid-level in their writing career, whatever?
Yeah. So while hard science may seem a bit constraining at first glance, remember that my end message would be, remember that the potential is still nearly limitless. The beauty of science is that it does not concern itself with any absolute truth or end all be all. Rather, it's about iteration, falsifying our current claims and hypotheses, and exploring that which we still do not understand. There is, in essence, no limit to what can be achieved. All it takes is time. The same can be said with a well-crafted hard sci-fi story. With a little elbow grease, you can draw your reader into a world that they may never have considered, expose them to concepts that they might never have come across. For example, Andy Weir's The Martian. It's a compelling narrative that's crafted around the main character surviving using disciplines such as botany, chemistry, engineering. This level of accessibility through actual scientific processes, it could potentially cause the reader to pause and think to themselves, I'd like to learn more about this. In my mind, my final takeaway is that if you can write a sci-fi story that not only thrills the reader, but gets them to think about the underlying science in your story, then you have succeeded on a level that no other writer in any other genre can claim. And I think that that's something beautiful.
Yeah, I'd say that there are two things. One, remember that not all science fiction is going to require the same level of detail and fidelity. Figuring out the right level of science needed for your story is a skill unto itself, and the best way to practice it, I think, is to make yourself aware of the kinds of stories that science fiction can tell, and to figure out the particular subset of those stories that you want to tell. In my experience, once you understand the story you want to tell, the amount of science you need will make itself clear to you in due time. Secondly, also speaking as someone who likes to world build both for its own sake and as a way of discovering what stories I want to tell, developing minor world building details like having to slow down your starship before you land, or the Toto's wonderful example of his temperature-based teleportation drive. It can be surprisingly useful in the long run because it seeds both your mind and your story with possibilities that might prove useful when you least expect it. Even if only a fraction of the details you conjure up end up making it into the final product, you'll still come away from the experience with a much deeper grasp of your story and what makes its world tick.
Awesome.
Yes, so science restricts what's possible in the story in ways that are inherently perfectly logical and don't feel like assholes. It allows you to come up with new ideas thanks to those restrictions rather than in spite of them. A character's arc always has to overcome challenges, and using science to come up with those challenges makes them all the more satisfying to overcome.